Welcome back to our book review. I want to start today by asking you to do a little mental time travel with me. Go back to, say, 1985. You've just finished a long day. Get home, kick off your shoes, sit on the couch and turn on the TV at 6 and quag. What happens?
Well, you watch the news. And not just any news. You watch the news.
Exactly.
You've got that, 3 channels, maybe 4 if you're lucky. And earlier that morning, you probably picked up the paper that landed on your doorstep with a thud. And that was your world.
That was the perimeter of what you knew.
Yeah.
We call that the push era. In media terms, information was, pushed at you by a tiny number of very large companies.
You were the bucket. They were the hose.
Perfectly put. But today I'm sitting here, I pull out my phone and I have a global library in my pocket. If I want to know about, 14th century French architecture or the latest viral meme, I pull that content. To me,
it feels like total freedom, right? The pull era.
It does. It feels like we are finally in the driver's seat. But today, we're looking at a book that argues that this feeling of freedom might be, a bit of an illusion.
Or at least it's masking something much more complex.
We are reviewing The Digital Difference by W. Russell Neuman. I have to say, this isn't just a book about, hey, isn't the internet fast?
No, not at all. Neuman is a heavy hitter in this field, and what he's proposing here is a total paradigm shift. He says we have been having the wrong argument about media for 100 years.
100 years, for a century.
He thinks that until we understand this digital difference, we're essentially flying blind through this information storm.
The wrong argument. That's a bold claim. We've been arguing about this stuff since radio was invented.
We have. But think about the shape of that argument. It's always been this binary debate. On one side, you have the Big Brother camp, the fear that media controls our minds, that it brainwashes us.
The Orwellian night, the idea that if I watch enough violent movies, I'll become violent.
Right? And on the other side, you have the minimal effects researchers. These are the scientists who run the studies and come back and say, actually, looking at the data, media, doesn't change people's minds all that much.
You watch the movie, eat your popcorn, you go home, and you're fine.
Exactly. And Neuman is here to tell us that both of those sides are outdated.
So today, our mission is to break out of that binary. We're going to unpack what Neuman calls the 4 Ps: Profusion, Polysomy, polarization, and pluralism.
It sounds a little technical, I know.
It does. But stick with us, because by the end of this, we're going to see why big data might be the only thing that can finally explain what is happening to all of us.
And honestly, the conclusion is a bit chilling. It turns out the pull era might have its own strings attached.
Okay, well, to understand where we're going, we have to look back at where we came from. We have to go back to the ghosts of propaganda.
Right.
Because communication research wasn't born in a comfortable university lecture hall, was it?
No, it was born in a bunker, metaphorically speaking. You have to picture the 1940s, the 50s, the shadow of World War II, the rise of the Cold War. The Rockefeller Foundation puts together this group led by a guy named John Marshall, and they aren't just curious academics, they are terrified, genuinely terrified.
Terrified of what?
Nazi and Soviet propaganda they saw, how entire nations seemed to just fall under a spell. They watched educated, rational populations seemingly turn into mobs overnight.
And they needed to understand how it works.
Fast. And out of that fear came this theory called the hypodermic needle.
Or the magic bullet. I just found that image so visceral.
It's a very specific, very scary image. The idea is that media acts like a needle. It bypasses your critical thinking, your logic, your personality.
Just injects it straight in.
Injects ideas directly into your brain. You are completely helpless, the screen flickers, and you obey.
It feels very dramatic. Very Manchurian Candidate.
It was. That was the cultural vibe you had Vance Packard writing The Hidden Persuaders, warning that advertisers were using subliminal messages.
Right. Flashing images of popcorn too fast to see to make us buy things we didn't want.
Yes, you had George Orwell's 1984 with the 2 minutes hate. The fear was of the atomized individual.
The idea that we were all just these lonely people, disconnected, sitting alone in the dark, being programmed by Big Brother. But wait, we know that subliminal advertising doesn't really work like that. We know we aren't robots.
Exactly. And that's where Neumann starts his critique. He looks at this whole foundation and says this concept of propaganda, it's flawed.
How is it flawed? I mean, propaganda exists. We see misinformation campaigns every day.
It exists. But Neumann argues the term itself is asymmetric.
Asymmetric.
It implies a bias. It implies I speak the truth, you speak propaganda.
Oh, I see.
It assumes the bad guys are manipulating and we just need to get the good truth out there to fix it. It frames communication as this battle between lies and truth.
And Neumann thinks that's too simple.
He thinks it ignores human nature, so he introduces a concept called balanced communication.
Balanced communication. That sounds like something I'd not add in a meeting while secretly Googling it under the table. Break that down.
It just means we need to accept that all communication, whether it's a Nazi poster, a Super Bowl ad, or you texting your spouse about dinner, is self-interested.
So it's not just the bad guys.
Not at all. When humans communicate, we are always asking a fundamental primal question, friend or foe.
So instead of asking how do we stop the lies, we should be looking at the playing field itself and admitting that everyone is pushing some kind of agenda.
That's it exactly. It shifts the focus away from persuasion. Did this specific ad change your vote to something much more complex about identity? About survival? We aren't helpless victims. We're active participants, scanning for threats and allies.
Which brings us to the modern problem. If we aren't just sitting there, we're now actively hunting for information. But there is just so much of it. This is the first P, right?
Profusion, the paradox of profusion. We all feel this, don't we?
I feel it every time I open Netflix and spend 45 minutes scrolling until I just give up and go to bed.
Right? Or when you Google a health symptom and get 12 million results, all telling you you're dying. That's it.
Yeah.
Neumann points out that this explosion of information is a mathematical inevitability. The ratio of what is knowable to what we can actually know is just skyrocketing.
And he updates that old cliche, the needle in a haystack.
Yes, we used to talk about finding a needle in a haystack, which implies it's hard, but possible,
If you look long enough, you'll find it.
Neumann says. Forget that. Today, it's not about finding a needle in a haystack. It is about finding a specific needle in a haystack, sized mountain of needles.
That is.
Yeah.
Just picturing that makes me tired. It's overwhelming.
It sounds terrifying. And this leads to that term we hear constantly, information overloads.
Right? We're drowning in data.
But Norman and the experts he cites argue that information overload is actually a red herring.
Hold on. How can it be a red herring? I literally just complained about the Netflix paralysis. That feels like overload to me.
It feels like it, but are you actually overloaded? I mean, do you faint? Do you stop functioning?
Well, no, I just picked the office for the 100th time.
Exactly. You filter. Neumann uses the frog and boiling water analogy. If you dropped a frog from 1950 into the internet of today, you would go into shock. But because the change was gradual for us to inquire to newspaper, to 24-hour news, to the web, we adapted. We aren't boiling, we are swimming.
So we just built better mental filters over time. We have had to.
There's a brilliant quote from Herbert Simon, a Nobel Prize winner, that sums this up perfectly. He said, "A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention."
Wow, that's profound. So the problem isn't the volume of information. The information is cheap. The scarce resource is us, our attention.
Correct. People don't actually crash from having 50 million Google results. They look at the first 3 links maybe and ignore the rest. The crisis isn't the volume, it's the structure of the information and how we decide what gets to the top of that mountain of needles.
There's a cost. You hear people like Nicholas Carr, who wrote The Shallows, arguing that the internet is literally rotting our brains, that we can't think deeply anymore.
That is the brain on computers. Panic. It's a very popular idea, but Neumann pushes back with neuroscience. He talks about neuroplasticity.
The brain's ability to rewire itself.
Yes, our brains are incredibly adaptable. If we spend our time online, our brains adapt to be better at skimming and scanning. It's not brain damage, it's adaptation.
So we should stop worrying that our hardware is breaking
And start focusing on the dynamics of attention. How do we decide where that flashlight points in the dark?
Okay, so we had this mountain of needles we're filtering like crazy to save our attention. But here's the kicker. Even when two people manage to pick up the exact same needle, they don't see the same thing.
And this brings us to the next P, polysomy.
Polysomy. Now, there's a word that sounds expensive.
It's a filer word for a very simple, very messy human reality. It just means that communication is inherently ambiguous. Messages have multiple meanings depending on who's hearing them.
Neuman talks about the semantic fallacy,
Which is basically the arrogant belief that when I say something to you, you are hearing exactly what I intend for you to hear.
which is almost never true.
Almost never. And there's this fantastic anecdote in the book about Walter Lippmann, one of the fathers of modern journalism, describing an experiment in Germany.
Oh, I love this story. It's like a scene from a movie.
It really is. So imagine a psychology conference room full of 40 trained observers, experts, scientists, people whose job it is to notice details. And suddenly, in the middle of a lecture, the doors burst open. A clown rushes in.
Chased by a guy with a fake gun. Right.
It was a staged brawl. Total chaos. A masked man, a weapon. It lasts maybe 20 seconds, and then they're gone. The professor stands up and says, okay, write down exactly what you just saw.
And these are trained observers. They must have nailed it.
You would think. The result? Most of the accounts were completely wrong, and 10 of them were pure invention. They described things that didn't even happen,
They just hallucinated details.
essentially. And the takeaway is so profound, people didn't see the actual fight. They saw their stereotype of a fight. They filled in the gaps with what they expected to see.
That's wild. It just proves audiences aren't passive buckets waiting to be filled with information like that hypodermic needle theory.
No, we are actively directing the movie in our own heads, and sometimes we edit that movie to fit our worldview. This leads to what Neuman calls the Archie Bunker effect.
Right? For younger listeners, Archie Bunker was the main character in an old sitcom, All in the Family. He was a lovable bigot, I guess you'd say.
Right? And the creator, Norman Lear, was a progressive. The whole point of the character was satire. He wanted to make fun of bigotry to show how ridiculous Archie looked.
But that's not how it worked out for everyone.
No studies showed that a huge chunk of the audience, people who held those same prejudices, didn't see the satire. They watched the show and thought, finally, a guy who tells it like it is right on Archie.
So the satire actually reinforced the bigotry for the people who already agreed with him.
Exactly. That is polysomy in action. The same message was interpreted in two completely opposite ways.
That explains so much about social media today. You see something and half the comments are, "This is a masterpiece," and the other half are, "This is a crime against humanity."
They're all looking at the same 280 characters. It's why measuring media effects is so incredibly hard. You can't just measure the input.
You have to understand the decoder ring inside the person's head. So if we were all seeing different movies, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. How do we agree on anything?
Well, that leads us directly to the next section, the tribal mind and polarization.
Now, we usually talk about polarization like it's this new terrible thing caused by algorithms or cable news. But Neumann seems to think it goes deeper.
Much deeper. He argues it is hardwired, it is evolutionary. And he points to this classic study by Osgood, Susi, and Tannenbaum on the semantic differential.
Okay, hold on. Semantic differential. We're getting technical again.
It sounds complex, but it's actually about cavemen.
Cavemen.
These researchers found that across all cultures, doesn't matter where you are in the world, humans judge meaning along 3 universal dimensions. Before we even process logic, we process these feelings.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first, and by far the most important, is evaluation. Good versus bad.
Or more primitively, friend or foe.
Friend or foe, exactly. If I'm a hunter-gatherer, the first thing I need to know about that rustling in the bush is it going to kill me or can I eat it? Logic comes much, much later.
Right? Survival. First. What are the other two?
The second is potency, strong versus weak. And the third is activity, active versus passive.
So before I even listen to a politician's argument about tax policy, my lizard brain has already decided, is this guy a friend and is he strong?
Precisely. We are tribal. We seek identity reinforcement. Neuman's argument is that polarization isn't some evil invention of Facebook. It is the natural state of balanced communication. We are always looking for our tribe.
So the challenge isn't to fix polarization, because that's just human nature. We can't delete the friend or foe filter from our brains.
No, but we can look at the system. The challenge is ensuring the playing field. The media structure allows for pluralism despite that tribal instinct. We need a system that forces us to see the other tribe occasionally.
But to design that system, we need to know what's actually going on. We need to measure how people are consuming this stuff. And this, according to Neumann, is where we've been failing for 50 years.
And this is my favorite part of the book because it just exposes how bad our data has been. Section 5, the farm affairs problem.
This is a hilarious story. Set the scene for us.
Okay, so it's the 1950s. The University of Michigan sends researchers down to the rural South to survey people about their media habits. You know, what do they care about?
Standard clipboard stuff. What do you listen to on the radio?
Right? And when the data comes back, the researchers are shocked. These rural, relatively isolated farmers are expressing incredibly high interest in foreign affairs.
Which makes no sense. Why are they obsessed with international diplomacy?
The researchers are scratching their heads. Is there some hidden society of geopolitical experts in the backwoods? Finally, someone goes back to check the interview notes or tapes. And it turned out in their heavy southern drawl,
They weren't saying foreign affairs, they were saying farm affairs.
yes, farm affairs. They were talking about tractors and crop rotation. The researchers thought they were talking about the UN.
That's amazing, but it perfectly illustrates the problem. If you ask people what they think, you get misunderstanding, or worse, you get lies.
The lies are rampant, Neumann points out. If you look at surveys, people claim to watch highbrow documentaries and masterpiece theater.
But if you look at the Nielsen ratings,
They're binge-watching The Bachelor and Real Housewives. We perform for the surveyor. We want to look smart. So you can't trust memory, and you can't trust self-reporting.
and then there's Jackson's conundrum, right? Sally Jackson.
Right? She critiqued the whole method of testing media effects in a lab. You know, you take a student, show them one video, and ask, did this persuade?
Seems logical. That's how we test medicine.
But Jackson says a message is just too complex. Was it the logical argument that persuaded the student? Or was it the sad music? Was it the color of the actor's shirt?
Was it the fact that the student was hungry? You can't isolate the variables.
It's too messy. Exactly. So we have a crisis, we have perfusion, we have polysomy, we have polarization, and our tools for measuring all of this are broken.
It sounds hopeless. We have no idea what media is actually doing to us.
Always hopeless. Until now, enter the Deus Ex Machina.
Big data.
This is the digital difference. We are moving from an era of asking questions to an era of digital footprints.
We no longer need to ask you what you watched. We know what you watch.
We know what you clicked. We know how long you hovered over that image. We know what you searched for at 2 o'clock a.m. when you couldn't sleep. We see the behavior you would never admit to a surveyor.
It's a truth serum.
It is. And for computational social science, this is the holy grail. It lets researchers finally study the conditions of effects. We can see these reinforcing spirals, how clicking one angry video leads the algorithm to feed you 10 more.
So it sounds like we're finally getting the tools to map the entire haystack.
We are. It shifts the entire field.
Okay, let's bring this all home. This is a lot to process. We started with the fear of the hypodermic needle that media injects thoughts into our heads.
And we realized that was too simple. We moved to the digital difference. We realized we're drowning in needles. That's perfusion.
We're seeing what we want to see. That's Polysomy.
When we're sorting ourselves into tribes, that's polarization.
And the big shift Neumann identifies is moving from studying persuasion. Did this ad change your mind to studying attention?
That is the key in a world of infinite content, the most valuable resources. Attention. It's not about convincing you of an argument. It's about just capturing your eye in the storm.
It feels like we're on the verge of finally understanding how this machine works. But there's a flip side to this big data solution, isn't there? I can't help but feel a little uneasy.
There is, and this raises a question that I think every listener needs to sit with. Go on, think about it. We started with the fear of propaganda. Then we found out, hey, humans are pretty stubborn. We filter things out.
Right? The minimal effects theory gave us some comfort. We aren't robots.
But now we have big data. And if big data gives researchers, and let's be honest, huge corporations, the ability to bypass our faulty memories and see our actual behaviors, our digital DNA.
If they know my tribal mind better than I do, if they understand my bias is better than I do.
Exactly. If the algorithm knows precisely what your friend or foe responds, and it knows exactly what needle you're looking for in that haystack, does that finally give them the power of propaganda that the 1950s researchers only feared they had?
That is terrifying. You're saying the hypodermic needle might not have worked back then because their aim was bad, but now they have laser guidance?
In the poll media age, we feel like we are pulling the strings. But if the system is designed to predict your every poll, who is really in control?
That is something to chew on next time you're doomed scrolling. We hope this Bok review gave you a new lens to look at your newsfeed today. As always, thanks for listening, and we will catch you on the next one.